For a quarter century since the 9/11 attacks, Americans and the rest of the West have been repeatedly told that Islam is a religion of peace and that it is forbidden to draw conclusions about the nature of the Muslim and Arab world from Islamist terrorists, and the plague of Islamophobia is, along with racism, one of the original sins of the West. But what if the truth is that far from being prejudiced against Islam, the West has essentially disarmed itself against a deadly foe that seeks its destruction in the name of pluralism, and that in the name of inclusion, it is acquiescing to surrender to a movement rooted in religious faith that is inimical to the values of Western civilization? Next, on Think Twice, we'll take a deep dive into the threat posed by Islam and Islamists to the West. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with journalist Ben Poser about the debate about the nature of Islam and its threat to the West. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The last thing that most Americans and citizens of other Western democracies want to do is to behave in a discriminatory fashion against any minority, especially religious groups. Religious liberty is, as its placement in the Bill of Rights indicates, our first freedom, and it must be defended. In America, we have no established religion, and the freedom to practice any faith is inviolate. But that doesn't mean Americans and others in the West should be blind to the threat posed by radical Islam and Islamist movements that elevate jihad, a crusade to conquer and subjugate other faiths, to an essential element of their belief system. Yet that is exactly what many in the West are doing by turning a blind eye to the danger of allowing adherents of such faith into their countries. In Western Europe, this has meant a fundamental shift in the political culture of many nations that undermines their national identity and calls into question their willingness to defend civil liberties and genuine diversity, since political Islam is at odds with those values. It also involves not just tolerance for antisemitism and hatred for the State of Israel, but legitimization and mainstreaming of the worst sort of anti-Jewish hate. This has been enabled by both the bizarre red-green alliance that brings Marxists and antisemites together with Islamist antisemites, who both hate the West. It's also getting support from extreme right-wingers who unite with them in Jew hatred. But it's benefited from the acquiescence of Western liberals, who would seemingly rather let their civilization and values be overthrown by a belief system that is antithetical to their values than to be accused of Islamophobia, which is itself nothing more than a way to silence criticism of Muslim and Arab antisemitism, intolerance, and support for jihadist terror. Moreover, it is impossible to discuss the post-October 7th war between Israel and Hamas without placing it in the context of what is truly a clash of civilizations that few in the West want to acknowledge. To discuss this serious threat to America and the West, we're pleased to have with us Ben Poser, the executive editor of White Rose magazine, which has devoted its most recent issue to discussion of the death cult of Islam. Ben Poser is executive editor of White Rose magazine, executive director of the American Anti-Slavery Group, and former research director for the Jewish Leadership Project. His articles have been featured in Front Page Magazine, the Jerusalem Post, JNS, and Tablet. He holds a degree in classical archaeology and ancient history from Brandeis University. Ben Poser, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you why White Rose, which is a magazine named after the anti-Nazi resistance in Germany, chose to devote an entire issue of your magazine to the threat from Islam, and how is a focus on this subject compatible with your mission statement of defending liberalism?
Well, that's a wonderful question. So in the past, we've done lots of issues. We've done issues like leftism versus liberalism. We've done issues about extremism from all points of view. We've done a lot of stuff about lies about Israel. And we had a lot of conversations, and particularly in after October 7th and later. And we saw that Islam really was one of the most important things facing the Western world, and definitely the Jewish community. And we also were seeing, and this was perhaps even more interesting, we were seeing on social media a lot of people saying certain things which would never have been said 10 or even 5 years ago. People really going to the mark and going into even the Islamic sources and showing that there are structural problems with Islam which are relevant to what you see in the actual world in terms of people's behavior. And we decided that this was worthy of very deep scrutiny. We did an issue about a month and a half or so after October 7th in the November. And then we just did one about a month ago going deeply into Islam. And we covered it from a lot of different angles. One thing we did was we reprinted a piece from Tablet by a dear friend of mine, Simon Deng, who was himself a slave in Sudan when he was a child. He's a South Sudanese Shilluk tribesman who was enslaved by Arabs. And we had a wonderful piece by Dumasani Washington of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel talking about the history of Islamic slavery. We had a piece about Christian persecution in the Muslim world by Raymond Ibrahim, which we were able to license from, I believe it was Gatestone. And we have a lot of other original content. We got a piece by a person who had to use a false name, actually, about what's going on in Minnesota, a person who lives in Minnesota detailing the Islamic takeover of that state. The very good example of someone who's taken it over is the current Attorney General, the great Keith Ellison. He used to be called Keith X when he was in the Nation of Islam. And we figured that this was something we had to deal with head on, because very understandably, there are a lot of reasons to not talk about it head on. To use different words, to say that, this is a distortion of Islam, this is radical Islam, this is an ism which is based upon Islam. But if you look at the basic text of Islam, and I have the Quran here, I also have the critical Quran, but we don't want to be critical, do we, and Islamophobic. So let's use the uncritical Quran, which is, my translation here is the Darussalam translation from the Saudi government. It's right there. And it's not only sort of theoretical evidence, if you understand what I mean. This translates directly into the evidence of human behavior, which we see in the real world. And I'll just give you one example. So, for example, in the Quran, there's the verse 2191. And in 2191, this actually is the verse which describes what's happening in Israel. This is the entire Islamic problem with Israel. And so it says, how does it start? It says, and kill them wherever you find them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out. And al-fitna, which means strife, is worse than killing, and fight not them at al-Masjid al-Haram, which means the Temple Mount, the sanctuary of Mecca, unless they first fight you there, but if they attack you, then kill them, and so on. So what that means is, this is the Islamic verse which established the precedent for any land being conquered by Muslim armies remaining Islamic forever. And this includes the land of Israel. And then what did those pesky Jews do? They came back to their ancient homeland and then bought the land legally and then decided to create a polity on it once the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. And theologically, this is just not acceptable. And so that's why the whole problem exists.
I guess the response from some liberals would be that you're cherry picking things out of a religious text. One could do the same thing to the Bible or various other religious texts from Judaism or Christianity. This is not how Muslims today think. These are questions that can be resolved. They're not a matter of faith. Why are they wrong?
Well, they're wrong for one. They're wrong for a lot of different reasons. The one very important one. Let's go back to the Quran. This is Surah 33, verse 21. And what does this verse say? It says that, indeed, in the messenger of Allah, Muhammad, you have a good example to follow him, for who hopes for the meeting with Allah and the last day, and remembers Allah much. So, if you pray 5 times a day, you acknowledge the prophethood of Muhammad. And what that verse is saying, along with 90 other verses in the Quran, is that Muhammad, the central figure of Islam, is an example for you to follow, is an example for you to imitate. And Muhammad's behavior, as I'm sure a lot of us know by now, was not very exemplary. He killed hundreds and hundreds of Jews. He massacred his own tribe. He robbed his own tribe's caravans. He married a very young child. And these show up in the behavior of Islamic communities, and this also shows up in jihad against Israel. He said, I can pull it out if you like, I've been made victorious with terror, in one of the ahadith, which is very, very, very well accepted in the Islamic world, Sahih al-Bukhari. This is a set of traditions of what Muhammad did and said, which is accepted by the gigantic majority of Muslims, at least Sunni Muslims and Wahhabi Muslims. And also, just to go for another reason why Muslims don't believe this, or this is irrelevant, or this is just a theoretical debate, which has nothing to do with what people believe or how things are. Well, if you look at the actual state of the world today, people are actually imitating Muhammad. There's jihad all over the world. Why is Europe being conquered by Muslims when Muhammad established the doctrine of jihad? And also, here's another important thing. Muhammad preached theology in Mecca when he was a younger man, slightly younger man, for something roughly like 12 to 13 years. And he only achieved a relatively small following of something like 150 people. And then the preaching business seemed to not really work very well. And for a lot of reasons, he migrated north to Yathrib, which is what is today called Medina. And there, he became a jihadist. He went to war against his own people, and that's when Islam actually became important and powerful. That's when he became a warlord. And it's at that point, going forward, that he conquered the whole peninsula. And by the time he died in 632, every Arab was a Muslim, and there were no Jews left.
Why do we have to understand how to define jihad? This is obviously a key question, because Muslim apologists and clerics, people who go on American TV and, in the West, who they claim this is merely a word to describe internal struggle and not an actual military crusade against non-Muslims in which faith is a tool for conquest. Is that disingenuous? Can it mean both? How should we understand this concept? Because if indeed jihad as a form of conquest and terror is integral to Islam, that really, is something from which one ought to draw conclusions. But if it isn't, then the argument is you're just being discriminatory. You're just, being a bigot.
Well, there are people who have actually looked into this question. So if you look at the Islamic sources, there's the trilogy, it's called. There's the Quran, there's the Sirat Rasulullah. This is the sacred biography of Muhammad, it's late, and a few people have even questioned its historicity. But what's important is that, hundreds of millions of people believe it is literally true. And then you have the hadith, which are the collections of Muhammad's sayings and actions, and and the sayings of his companions. And if you put that all together and analyze it statistically, in total, 67% of his biography concerns military matters, 21% of Sahih al-Bukhari's hadith, the book I just showed, and 9% of the Quran. So when you take that together, it's roughly a third of the Islamic corpus which concerns military matters. And by military matters, that means jihad. And also, if you examine the hadith concerning jihad in the Bukhari collection, which is probably the most authoritative source, the one which is agreed upon in terms of its authenticity, about 98% of the mentions of jihad or words like it are violent. And these are books we didn't write. You know, I didn't write it, you didn't write it, Douglas Murray didn't write it. This is what Muslims have been reading for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is very, very well established. But most importantly, this is what shows up in the in the conduct of Islamic history. And I'll just pull up these two maps here, which I printed out. If you look at the first one, this is extraordinary. By 750 CE, which is not too long after Muhammad died in 632, almost the whole known world is Islamic. It's part of this empire. How did this happen? Did this happen by peaceful coexistence and by peaceful conversion, or by sending missionaries out to preach people? No, it didn't. And then today, if you look here, there's another map. This shows the distribution of Muslim majority societies. Now, it's true that Indonesia over here was largely converted by traders, but that's pretty much the only exception, give or take. This empire, this ummah it's called, the community of believers, was established by military violence. And it wasn't nice military violence. And non-Muslims were treated with great disdain. Some managed to rise up, and because Islam was very, very, in some ways, was much more shrewd about dealing with minorities than the Christians were. The Christians kind of said, okay, we will tax the Jewish moneylenders and we will borrow money from the Jews, and then once we owe them too much money, we'll expel them. In Islam, you have the jizya system, where the conquered peoples pay a special tax of half their income, whatever it may be, a year. And so that's what supports the Islamic economy. And that's the way in which Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians and later on some Hindus lived. But this was all established by military force. And the Quran establishes, this is 933, I'll read it to you, that Islam has a duty to conquer the entire world. And this is what the thing says. Yes, it is he who has sent his messenger, Muhammad, with guidance and the religion of truth, Islam, to make it superior over all other religions, through the mushrikun, the polytheists, pagans, idolaters, disbelievers in the oneness of Allah, hate it. So that among many other verses establishes the precedent that this is a global struggle. This is what jihad means. And many people have pointed out, interestingly, that jihad in Arabic means the same word as Kampf in German does. So it's, mein Jihad, Hitler could have written. And so this is a really serious problem that we don't recognize, and we don't want to talk about. Just the basic facts we see with our eyes, whether they're on a page or going on in the real world. And I guess that's how I'd answer that question, if that is satisfying.
Yeah, well, let me drill down just a little bit further into this, because clearly, historically, what you're saying is incontrovertible. But when we speak of Muslims, say, living in the United States today, the vast majority of whom are law-abiding, peaceful people. I mean, they're not all, it's not a population of terrorists. Whatever sympathies they might have for what's going on elsewhere in the world, or whatever prejudices they have, which is sort of a separate issue. But when they define jihad, are they also talking about, potential conquest of the rest of the world, the Dar Ashab, the world that is Islam and the world is not Islam? Or do they see it as, sort of the Islamic version of some New Age thinking about inner struggles? Yeah. What are they talking about?
Well, there are a couple of ways to talk about that. There are two ways which come to mind. The first one is that Islam creates Muslims, and Muslims don't create Islam. And that's true for other religions as well. But everybody is an individual person, and has their own personality and has their own view of the world. And many people, certainly we know this as Jews, many people don't observe every mitzvah. Judaism certainly is a different type of way of seeing the world than Islam is, and we can go into that further if you'd like. But
We will.
I sure hope so. But Islam, the thing about Islam is that in Islam you have a very large number of people, many of whom actually, this is a very, and talk about Judaism, this is a very interesting difference between Judaism and Islam. In Judaism, there has always been, going back quite a while, I'm not sure exactly where you'd put the date, but probably to the period after the Second Temple, to the beginning of the rabbinic period, where education is very, very, very important, and making sure that people, at least boys back then, knew as much about their religion as possible, and putting as many sons as you could into the yeshiva and to study with the Tana and the master. In Islam, this actually isn't usually the case. The rate of illiteracy, and we're not talking about the United States here, but it's representative. The rate of illiteracy in the Islamic world is enormous, because educating people very, very, very in a high resolution way about their religion isn't really a value. They go to the mosque, and what they hear at the mosque is terrible. And you can see that from memory.org. You can see that from Palestinian Media Watch, what they see in the mosques. But in America, these are people who, even if they're very, very, very well educated in a Western way, they may not necessarily know that much about Islam. And this is extremely common. And also an issue, and which is going around a lot in the Muslim community, particularly in America, but in the West in a much wider way, is that younger people are having issues with adhering to Islam. And this is in sermon after sermon from so many imams across the Western world, that they're being westernized, the girls are wearing makeup, the girls have boyfriends, they're on social media too much, and they're not going to classes, and they're not really following their religion. And so if you ask a Western person who identifies as a Muslim nominally, they may actually say, perhaps, that I think jihad is an inner struggle, and they may even mean it. That actually might happen. But also, if you think about Islam purely in terms of just flesh and blood people, that carries problems, because no criticism of Islam is, in my opinion, merited or proper if it concerns flesh and blood people. If it's some kind of racial judgment, which it isn't. Just like racial objections to immigration are completely absurd, because there are different immigrant groups, and some have behavior patterns and cultural values which are completely compatible with Western civilization, and others don't. And you look at England, you look at the Hindu community there, who are from the same subcontinent as people who are Muslim, and there aren't any problems comparatively at all. But looking at the way Muslims define their own religion is very difficult, because you look at Jews. If you ask a Reconstructionist rabbi what Judaism is to them, that's a very difficult question. And certainly the people who would be going into the media and writing things, they may not be, the most educated person. But also there is a tradition in Islam called tawhiyah, which is deception in the furtherance of Islam. And that's difficult to talk about, because it's unsavory, and it rightfully would make a decent person uncomfortable to attribute bad motives to other people, even before you hear them out. But that is a real thing. And actually, an example of that, you see, is everything we see in the media. For example, all of the stuff we see in the New York Times lately about the starvation, all the pally, what is it's called, with Richard Landis' wonderful term, that is a form of taqiyya, and Hamas engaging in that.
The blood libels being told about Israel starving and committing genocide.
Precisely. And so saying that jihad is just an internal struggle can sometimes be a part of that deception. And that's not something we really want to think about, but because it makes us very uncomfortable. But I think we have to.
Well, I guess the basic question here then is Islam incompatible with Western civilization? In effect, as one article in your recent issue claims, a counter-religion rather than a monotheistic companion to Judaism and Christianity, or as many academics in the last generation have tried to say, part of the Abrahamic religions. And is it possible to believe this about Islam and still maintain freedom of religion for all people in America and Western nations?
Well, that's a wonderful question. So the way I would look at it, first of all, is that in Islam, you have the problem that it, at its core, has a political element to it. In Judaism, you have the concept where the law of the land is the law. And Jews who live in the diaspora in a certain area, they defer to whatever the political law of the area is. And it is certainly very detrimental to them if they were to disobey it. In Islam, however, it views the law of Allah as applying to all people. It's not like halakha, which applies only to Jews, or canon law, which applies only to Catholics. The Sharia applies to all peoples. And the Sharia, as we know, as even somebody who might identify as Muslim and disagree with it would say, the Sharia is not compatible with Western civilization. This involves child marriage. This involves chopping up people's hands for stealing. This involves execution for many, many different crimes, many of which are not crimes in the civilized world, in the Western world. And also, under Islamic law, the basic rights which we all enjoy as part of the Constitution do not exist. Because in the Constitution, God gives you basic rights, and then it's the job of the government to protect them. In Islam, there are no rights. Everybody is a slave of Allah. Everyone's heard the name Abdullah. It's just a man's name. What that means is slave of Allah. In the Quran, it says that every single person ever created is a slave of Allah. And that is the relationship between the human being and the Creator, is that of a slave to a master, not as a child to a parent who has obligations to that parent, as in Judaism and Christianity. And so in talking about Islam's compatibility with the West, well, you just have to look at what goes on in the world, but how you translate these textual commandments and facts to the real world. Because, for example, if you look at the life of Muhammad, this is not somebody like King David, for example, who committed sins and did stupid things, but then reformed his character. This was a guy who killed lots of people.
And gets away with it.
Exactly. Did King David get away with anything? Precisely.
Well, we could drill down into that, but in the major elements of the story, obviously, he was punished every time he sins.
Exactly.
That's the nature of it. The prophet Nathan denounces him. He doesn't get away with it.
Exactly, but it gets even better. I went to something in Harvard many years ago, and I was talking to some guy in the street, some communist who didn't know anything about Islam. And he said, well, there are terrible things in the Bible, which the Jews did, or this or that person did. Well, first of all, in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, you're not supposed to do any of that again. That applies specifically to a very specific time. And also in Tanakh, you have this beautiful, as we were talking about with King David, we have this beautiful moral honesty about their character. Muhammad, who is a man who had a wife who he married when she was 6, and he first had sex with her when she was 9. This is in the Hadith, and it's mentioned a number of times. There's no moral honesty about that when you say that that man is the perfect example of conduct every Muslim should copy. You are supposed to emulate David's faith, his greatness as a poet in composing many of the Tehillim and so on, but you are not supposed to imitate his, very, very complicated sex life.
Right. You're not supposed to have the husband of the woman that
Exactly.
you want to that you covet killed.
And Muhammad did that, actually. He didn't do it through murder, but actually he was a man who was his slave, whom he freed, and then he adopted the man as his son. Part of this is documented in Surah 33 of the Quran. And then this guy had a wife. His name was Zainab, who was a cousin of Muhammad. And Muhammad thought this woman was very attractive, and he embarrassed this poor man into divorcing her so that he could marry her, and then he did. And the community considered this incest because he'd married a woman who was married to his adopted son. Incest in a legal sense. And so because of that, Muhammad, he abolished adoption so that this would never happen again. And he also got a special revelation from Allah, it is said, so that he could marry this woman and when she was somebody else's wife. And again, this is accepted as perfectly good conduct. We're moving into a tangent here, but I think it's still reasonable because there are basic kinds of conduct which are okay in Islam, which are not okay in our society. And
let me go back to something that you just were alluding to, but I think it is a common critique, not just from communists, but from even liberals, that critics of the West, or even people who adhere to the Western canon, will claim it is historic, that the West is as historically guilty of misdeeds and conquest as Islam. So why should we view Islam as somehow more of a threat to the West than the West is to third world nations, as many on the left contend?
Well, you gave the answer with your question. Because guess what? For example, we had slaves, we meaning Western people, and then we turn around and said, oh, damn it, that's a terrible idea. And we stopped. And we've spent generation after generation feeling terrible about it. I think a little bit more terrible than we should feel, but there's quite a bit of very, very serious and deserved.
And indeed, Britain spent, 100 years fighting the slave trade, and Americans fought a civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people died in order to abolish slavery.
Precisely. And in the Islamic world, you get, again, very well-educated people, westernized people here and there, but there is no comparable feeling of guilt, of collective guilt for Islam's participation in the slave trade at all. The fact that that hundreds of thousands of people in the West, if not many millions, believe that their own civilization is bad because of genuinely bad things it has done in the past indicates that Islam is much more of a problem because it does not have, let alone encourage, cultural criticism.
Well, I guess the question is, by tolerating and even enshrining Islam as an equal in Western nations, is, as some would argue, the West committing suicide via pluralism, and as arguably can be claimed is happening in parts of Europe. But if this is so, how can we defend liberal values by liberal means if, as some would argue, in countering this by saying that, well, this is just going to lead to discrimination against Muslims, even though I might add there is very little evidence of this now, and the notion of a post 9/11 backlash, which many in the media still claims against Muslims, is largely a myth.
Also, many of the hate crimes committed against Muslims, I found out last year when I was doing research for an article, actually came from CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is well known.
Well, I was going to get to them in a little bit, but sure,
well known.
These are but let's get to the question of how do we defend our pluralistic societies against groups or people who are against pluralism? How do we defend it by liberal means?
Well, I think that's very simple. You just enforce the laws which criminalize criminal acts. So, for example, I think this was in 2017. There was a couple. I think they were from Pakistan, perhaps, who were maybe in Minnesota, and they were arrested for performing clitorectomy, performing clitoral mutilation on
or as is known, female
Yes.
circumcision, right?
I think, as far as I don't recall that very, very, very clearly, but I believe that eventually they were let off. And that probably has to do with the corruption of the legal system in that state. If it is Minnesota, I just apologize for not remembering because it was 8 years ago. But when these things do come up, we sometimes don't always prosecute it properly. Certainly in Europe, I think that has been exploding. Certainly in England, the scandal of these gangs of Muslim men who have gone around in northern English cities raping untold numbers of little girls, and the media and the police and the government and everybody in the social services, the social workers, they knew about it and they didn't want to say anything because they thought they would be called racist by themselves if it's the media. And then, of course, they went around and did something horrendously racist, and they started calling the people when they were caught Asians, South Asians, as if the fact these people looked like other people from South Asia had something to do with this, and therefore smearing Sikhs and Hindus and anybody else from the Indian subcontinent who happen to look like these people who didn't do anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So just enforce the laws against what is illegal.
All right, well, that's fair enough. Let's talk about the red-green alliance that is so important in today's society. How does where Marxist anti-Semites come together with Islamist anti-Semites? How does this work? And why are so many liberals whose values are completely antithetical to what these people are advocating so loath to move against it?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, these days, as you know, we're seeing people who say or pretend to be conservatives, whose values are also, their purported values are also completely diametrically opposed to this too, joining it. I don't know if Tucker Carlson believes in child marriage, but he seems to be very fine with taking money from Qatar and slandering Israel all the same.
Well, I think that gets back to the common denominator of hostility to Jews in Israel. He's willing to make any common cause. He has a big tent when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, big tent is well spent. But when it comes to the Red Green Alliance, that comes from a couple of things. It comes from, first of all, a shared interest that the communist movement has a very, very nicely very nice correlation with the Islamic cause, and both of these are to destroy Western civilization, to destroy the ideas of theologically endorsed liberty, of the free market, of individuals being able to do as they please within a set of very cohesive morality, and so on, and also to have polities which are based on these principles. And so there's common cause right down the line, and there are even some very socialistic elements of Islam. The sharing out of the wealth of the conquered peoples through the jizya tax, which was given around to the Muslim poor throughout the empires, and using this to fund jihad. And Muhammad talks about some very socialistic things earlier in his preaching career, and so forth and so on. And this really came to a head with the KGB in the 60s, as we know. And though the PLO, which the KGB helped create in 1964, wasn't technically at that point an Islamic Quranic.
Right, it was a coalition of secular and Islamist groups.
Yeah, and that changed later on. Yes, Arafat got more Islamic. The identity of the Palestinian people got more and more Islamic as time went on. But just go back to the 60s, the intersection of the Soviet and Arab cause was a very good example of these two intersecting causes. because the Arab world wanted to destroy this piece of, Western, a Western liberal, rights-based polity within their land, and the Soviets wanted to help them do that because they wanted to battle American influence. As the years went on, things got more interesting. For example, the KGB and the Soviets were heavily involved in the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the coup against the Shah. It wasn't really as much of a popular uprising as people wanted people to think. It really was an Islamic alliance between an alliance between the Islamic elements headed by Ayatollah Khomeini and the communists. In fact, the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, one of the so-called opposition groups, is actually both an Islamic and communist organization, which sided with Saddam Hussein in the war against and the Iran-Iraq war and killed a lot of Iranians needlessly. But that's an example. The Islamic Revolution is a wonderful example of how the KGB saw this time, really, really, really believing Muslims as a way to achieve its ends. And as you go on, and certainly people like Edward Said and Noam Chomsky have their roles in this. And by the time you get to the present, you have this needless to say, rather erotic coalition between these two groups, which is very, very, very flagrant. And we can see it everywhere because both of these things want the same end, which is the end of us, just to put it very, very flatly.
How best can we understand the October 7th massacres and the war against Hamas that followed, and the enormous pushback against Israel in which Hamas propaganda, blood libels against the Jews, has been mainstream and legitimized in the context of this civilizational struggle? And let me add, how does this fold into sort of the progressive takeover of much of American society in the West with racial theories like critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism? How does that fold into the sort of jihadist belief and sort of the Red-Green Alliance? Why are, it sounds very different. They come from very different places. But how do they come together to this really ideological jihad against Israel and the Jews that has really flamed up after October 7th?
Well, they come together principally on the campuses as far as where they physically are. But what's so interesting is, and this reminds me of something Saul Alinsky did, one of the great American communist theorists about how to take over American politics from the outside, and then people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton brought it inside. And I forget what year this was. This might have been something like 1969 or 70. He went to some event where George H. Walker Bush, George Bush's father, was speaking, and he brought his kids with him, and they wore Klan uniforms, and they clapped. The situation with accusing Israel of genocide, accusing Israel of apartheid, and accusing Israel of being a colonial project, that's just a way of smearing Israel, which is very important because, like Saul Alinsky said in other contexts, accuse your enemies of what you do.
Yeah, it's gaslighting.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I guess, let me just switching a little bit from October 7th to something that is endemic in the Middle East and the Muslim world. How is it that so many in the West prefer to blame the Jews for what's going on in the Middle East rather than acknowledging the persecution of Christians in the Muslim world? You alluded to Tucker Carlson. He's had sort of Christians who sympathize with the Palestinian cause of destroying Israel, yet never acknowledging in those programs on his podcasts, yet never acknowledging that the situation of Christians in Palestinian Arab society has gotten increasingly worse because they're being driven out by Muslims.
Well, it's because people don't want to blame who's actually doing it. Because if you blame the people who are doing it, if you blamed Muslims, then you'd be considered Islamophobic. And also in the when it comes to the Christian world, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with bigotry here, but the Christian world has often had a problem with calling out the persecution of Christians around the world, calling out the church calling out persecution of itself. And this has often happened. And one example where it happened was in Sudan in the early 1990s, where Christians were being massacred in Sudan as part of a jihad, a racist jihad, in which there was quite a lot of slavery. And the Christian world in the United States was very slow to react because the Christian world, funnily enough, doesn't have as much of a oneness in its identity as you'd expect, the body of Christ and all this kind of thing. And so that's one reason why they're not always interested. And I have many friends involved in Christian human rights activism who can talk about this. But when it comes to not blaming the Muslims who are persecuting the Christians, some of this has to do with fear, I think, on the part of some sometimes Arab Christians who know that they have to engage in what I guess I call, Makkah syndrome, where they have to adopt the prejudices of the people who've oppressed them for so long because they need to stay alive. I think people like Muntar Isak, the pastor Tucker Carlson interviewed last year, is somewhat of an example of that, though I think he does actually believe that bigotry, and he's an avowed Marxist. He's been involved with, what's it called, Christ at the Checkpoint.
Well, I think historically Christian Arabs have been eager to be part of the Arab nation and embracing a sort of secular Arab nationalism. They were the ones who more or less invented secular Arab nationalism, but inevitably they get folded into the Islamic crusade, the Islamic jihad, because that's the only way to stay in sync with other Arabs and the Muslim majority. And let me just add, is this sort of another manifestation of a word we really haven't used very much in this conversation, or perhaps at all, of dhimmi, of sort of a minority within the Islamist world? And you either accept it, and you sort of play along that you're a tolerated minority, tolerated and despised minority, or, you revolt against it, or you just refuse to play that role, which obviously by creating a Jewish state, Jews are not content to be dhimmi and a protected or not protected despised minority in the Muslim majority world, which is why talk of creating a state where Israel exists, in which which would not be a Jewish state, is just a formula for Jewish suicide.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's very interesting is that there are not a lot of particularly Arab Christians in the general human rights world, the media world, who talk about their own persecution. This is part of it because they have been so oppressed, and the dhimmi system really, that's been going on for 1,400 years. The dhimmi system, whereby the non-Muslim has to submit and to accept inferior status, and people call it second-class status. I don't like that term because I always am reminded of the fact that the second-class compartments and on the old English trains were actually pretty nice. This is a non.
Well, they were also heading in the same direction as the first class.
Exactly, and it's a non-citizen semi-slave status where you have to pay half your income every year and be humiliated, and you can't carry a sword, and you can't ride a horse, and you can't repair your church or synagogue. This changes the psychology completely throughout the whole culture. But also Christian Arabs, very unfortunately for them, they've had a number of anti-Jewish influences. The first one, of course, was Christianity, and the antipathy to Jews of the crucifixion and so on and so forth from that. Also, those more Eastern churches took a little while longer to disavow anti-Judaism than the Catholic Church did,
or have not at all.
Yeah, exactly. And there's that, and then you had Islam, which we've talked about, where the Jews are the ultimate enemies of Islam. There's a hadith which is very often you'll see in from imams all the time, which is from Sahih Muslim, a different collection, which is The hour will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, and they will hide behind the rocks and the trees, and the trees will cry out, Ya Muslim, Ya Abdullah, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there's a Jew, hide behind me, come and kill him. And then lastly, there's the communist and socialist propaganda. Many of the communist and socialist movements in particularly the area of Israel were started by nominal Christians. George Habash, who started the PFLP, he was nominally Christian. And so sadly, there's not been that much of a resistance to the Islamic oppression of Christians within the Middle East. There's been some, of course, and there's been a little bit, of course, happening lately. But there's never really been kind of like a Christian version of Zionism. Like, we want to have a Christian state in the Middle East, come hell or high water, because we've lived here for long before Islam and we deserve one. There's no real equivalent of that.
Except perhaps in Lebanon, and that they didn't actually wind up defending it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the most glaring instances in which the differences between the West and the Islamic world is made manifest is the toleration of slavery in Africa, which I know is a specific, important concern for you. The question is, why do most Americans and citizens of Western nations know pretty much they know nothing about the continuation of the trans-Sahara slave trade in our own day, let alone draw any conclusions about it?
As we were talking about a little while before, it's so deeply embedded in our society, thanks to the left, that slavery is basically something started by the British, and that nobody prior to the British Empire ever had slaves. And in Europe, maybe they'll know a little more about, the Dutch or something. But this has also to do with intersectionality a little bit. The idea that all oppressions are the same, and everybody who isn't white is oppressed, no matter what the circumstances are, and you have to come together to attack the middle, and whatever the middle is. That the middle is the history of the West and the United States, and this is very, very, very threatening to the dominant narratives we have. And I think also it takes away from some people's self-esteem, because if your culture is inherently racist and you want to rebel against it from within, that makes you pretty damn brave. It makes you a very virtuous person. But if the worst racial oppression happening in the world is happening at the hands of other people who aren't you, and you can't control, and so therefore you can't stop it, that actually makes you...
Oh, you can if you sort of turned against potential people you think are your allies.
Yes, but you can't personally stop it yourself, because if you're not the slave master because you're white or something, then I think that takes away from a lot of people's search for self-esteem.
And it's much harder to virtue signal about what's going on among communities that are all deemed as oppressed minorities. If they're oppressing each other, that doesn't seem to have the same cachet as if you can blame it on the West or blame it on Israel and the Jews.
Mm-hmm. And that's and it's an incredible industry. We've all seen this for years. The whole left is powered by this whole intersectional narrative. And also, of course, you go to the universities. The universities are filled with money from Arab countries, and some of these Arab countries still have slavery. Even many of the Abraham Accord countries, like Bahrain and the UAE. The UAE is very, very heavily implicated in this. They still have slavery. I've done a lot of research on how poor African women, usually from Uganda and Nigeria, they are trafficked to places like the UAE and also places like Egypt and there's Saudi Arabia and some even to Lebanon and other places like that, where they're looking for legitimate jobs, but then they get enslaved. They get their passports taken away from them and they become maids and they become sex slaves and things like that. And this happens in all these countries. But, so if you're some Arab country which wants to pay for influence in American university, Qatar too, it's not African slavery, but Qatar, people remember the scandals about the football stadiums being built, and these people from South Asia they bring in. It's a similar type of thing to Saudi Arabia, where they imported labor, and in the case of Qatar, the population is mostly foreign laborers. You don't want this taught in a university. You're not going to let people talk about how the country which funds your university is involved in human bondage, are you? Are you crazy? So it's a major, major, major point of hypocrisy for the world of people who supposedly have the values, and their values are superior to ours because they're so much smarter than us and they're better educated than we are. But they're not going to talk about it for a lot of reasons. But one of them, unfortunately, is what I talked about, is this money issue, which we have to clean up.
Yeah, let's turn a bit for a moment for our last question to something that is happening in the United States and North America. American Muslims have succeeded in getting mainstream status by supporting organizations and that have a Muslim Brotherhood Hamas ally group like CARE, or the Council on American Islamic Relations, masquerade as a civil rights group rather than as an apologist for anti-Semitism and terror. How have they gotten away with this? And do you think perhaps the tide now might be turning against them under the Trump administration?
Well, that's interesting. So you have a number of people who've gone to elected office. This isn't so much new. This is a number of years ago. People on the squad. You do have, of course, Zohan Mandani, and you have the fellow whose name escapes me, who's trying to be mayor of Minneapolis. And then, of course, we have Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General of Minnesota, and he's been in the news for various ways for a while. Thankfully, people were able to cover it. There is a growing influence, and the growing influence partially has to do with a growing population. But one of the things they've done is a shield to protect themselves from criticism is to use the organizations you were talking about, like I mentioned before, CARE, which is basically a Hamas money laundering operation. We know that. It's proven and documented from the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2007, weirdly enough, was declared a terrorist organization by the UAE, of all places, and not by the United States, when we knew that it was financing Hamas 18 years ago. They've used things like that, and they've used a real historical reluctance throughout American society since 9/11 to really talk about Islam, and also, and on the part of them, the decency of Americans not to blame flesh and blood human beings for a problem with an ideology, or let alone 9/11. But as I was talking about in the beginning, if you look at social media, and there are a lot of terrible things in social media, and so I don't go on X very often, but when you do, you will see a lot of people really thinking more clearly about this and saying, you know what, the data go in one direction, and they're going in the direction of there being a correlation between Islamic power in a society and major problems in that society. So, and the problems, unfortunately, are that the society could eventually look like the societies in the Middle East, in which there are no rights for people. There are no rights for women. There are no rights for people who hold liberal values. And these are the liberal values which bring people to not want to criticize people who weren't like them. And that's perfectly legitimate and decent, and I don't disagree with that. But you have to look at the data and make a judgment upon it. And to answer what you said about the Trump administration has mostly done a very good job at looking at these problems. And of course, they've been reasonably supportive of Israel. I think both of us could make criticisms, as you have in the past. But there are two issues which come to mind. The first one is very, very, very good. Marco Rubio announced recently that a designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization is in the works, and that's a wonderful thing. I don't know when that's going to happen. But the negative one is the administration's embrace of Qatar.
Yeah.
And
which is the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood,
exactly.
and which helps funds it and funds madrasas all over the world, indoctrinating people in radical Islam.
Yeah, and I've actually done research on Even K-12 stuff they've funded, which is very, very, very disturbing. Now, unfortunately, some of the people who have had connections with Qatar within the administration, I don't think are bad people. I don't think Kash Patel is a bad person, let alone an anti-Semite. I don't think Pam Bondi is an anti-Semite or a bad person. But Qatar is sought out to infiltrate and to, throw money around otherwise relatively decent Republican circles, and to get them to not really notice that they're a terrorist state. And I think all of us felt very, very, very badly about the time when Trump went to Qatar and he got the jet, and there was all this partying around. Everyone was very chummy. And I think a lot of American Jews, many of whom felt very supportive of Trump and even still do, and are grateful for all the other good things he's done, they felt betrayed by that, and they felt very, very, very worried that Israel relies on the United States so much as a guarantor of its security, and yet they're not treating the people who have helped torment them so much with the requisite derision and disgust, and also they've not punished them as they should have done. I told a friend of mine, well, there was some talk about sending the Gazans to Indonesia. Well, why not have have the talks there? Indonesia is a Muslim country, but at least Indonesia isn't the one paying for
they aren't funding Hamas.
Holding
Qatar is.
Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent point. Ben, we barely scratched the surface of this very important topic, but we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. You can read White Rose Magazine at whiterosemagazine.com and follow it on X at White Rose Mag, at White Rose Mag. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day to Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the podcast platforms. Go to jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, read JNS every day. And whether you're listening to us on any one of the various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.